Warning, the content of this podcast may be disturbing and graphic. It may contain explicit details, discussions of crime scenes, and descriptions that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Steve Clayton was in love with love. He'd been married so many times that his family had lost count, but this one, she would be his last wife. And that would be true, but not because they would live happily ever after. She would be his last wife because he would die mysteriously just 5 years after their marriage. 64-year-old Steve Clayton was a South Florida native. There, he attended Miami Military Academy and Miami Springs Senior High School, where he was recognized as a great track, football, and wrestling athlete. Steve attended Florida State University and graduated in 1976. He became a certified public accountant, starting his career in the finance department at Holy Cross Hospital in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He had an entrepreneurial spirit, and it wouldn't be long before Steve would start his own business, Physical Therapy Resources, for which he was the founder, president, and CEO. In 1995, Steve was able to sell this business for a great amount of money, entering retirement at just 40 years old, excited to explore the world. In 2009, Steve moved from Florida to North Carolina. He had been married at least 6 times, but he was now single and was looking for love again. He met Lana Walsh on a dating site in 2010, and the two hit it off right away. She was a sweet, quiet nurse from Oklahoma who now worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs in North Carolina. She was practically the opposite of boisterous Steve, but they were madly in love. They married just 3 years later in 2013 and moved into a beautiful, massive colonial mansion on Lake Wylie in South Carolina. Steve's nephew Chris remembers his uncle throwing lively parties at the home, with music, their 2 greyhounds and kids running around, good food, and fireworks above the lake. Steve was one to tell jokes, and he'd entertain his family members with them at these parties. To neighbors and family members, it was clear that Lana and Steve were very happy together. But it wasn't long before the cracks in their relationship started to show. Their longtime veterinarian, Nan Say, who would come to the home to care for their greyhounds, would catch glimpses of these cracks during her visits. She noticed that they weren't very happy. Lana didn't seem to say a word when she was in Steve's presence, and Nan thought that the relationship was very strange. Why would they even get married if that's how they were going to behave with each other, she thought. Steve had also confided in his nephew Chris, telling him that the marriage had taken a turn for the worse. There had been an incident between the two in 2016. Lana had accidentally shot Steve in the head with a crossbow while he was sleeping. Steve was okay. The injury was minor, and he and Lana both insisted that the act had been an accident, and there was no further investigation or explanation of what had occurred. It was strange, to say the least. And just 2 years later, Steve would take his last breath under suspicious circumstances in the Clayton mansion. On July 21st, 2018, James Blackledge is taking his motorcycle out for a mid-morning ride when he sees his neighbor, Lana Clayton, running toward him, waving him down, and begging him to call 911. He did.
Is this 911?
It is.
I was just riding by and a woman came running out and said her husband fell down the steps and she thinks he's dead.
As he's on the phone with dispatchers, Lana rushes to another close neighbor's home, and the three of them return to the Clayton home to survey the scene. Lana sat on the front porch as her two neighbors went in. Steve Clayton was lying at the foot of the stairs, and he was not breathing. They checked for a pulse. There was none. It appeared as though he'd taken a fatal tumble down the stairs. EMTs, police, and the coroner's deputy arrive. The coroner's deputy reported that the death appeared to be of natural causes, possibly from a heart attack. Lana had described the few days before Steve's death. He'd been ill. He was having a bout of vertigo, which was normal for him. He'd been nauseous and dizzy, and he hadn't been out of bed for 3 days prior to his death. One of the officers that had arrived on scene was another of Steve's nephews, Officer Nick French. Despite the opinions of the other deputies and deputy coroner, Nick immediately became suspicious of Lana Clayton. There were 2 phones in her home. She was a nurse. Why hadn't she used either of those phones to call 911? And why hadn't she been attempting CPR when EMTs arrived? He had always known his Uncle Steve to have his cell phone on him, but it was currently nowhere to be found. But Nick comforted Lana. If Steve's death was accidental, she was shocked, grieving, and suddenly widowed. He discussed her wishes for Steve's body. She told Nick that she was just overwhelmed. Thinking about funeral arrangements was just too much for her to handle just then. So, Nick offered to take Steve's body to the morgue to run a few tests, but Lana immediately interrupted. "No," she said. "That funeral home that's right down the road. We'll take him there and have him cremated." Weird, thought Nick. Just a minute ago, Lana couldn't fathom even thinking about making arrangements, and now, just like that, she'd suggested cremation. Nick and Lana discussed informing other family members about Steve's passing, but Lana insisted that she wouldn't want Steve's other nephew to see him this way. The minute Nick was out of earshot, however, he called Chris, who immediately informed Steve's sister of his death. She was devastated. She and her brother were very close. They talked often, but she hadn't heard from him for several days, and now he was gone. Friends and family gathered on August 4th for a backyard celebration of life to remember Steve. Not long after, his nephew Chris arrived to help Lana get his affairs in order. Steve had made him executor of the will, and he wanted to help Lana find it and get things organized. When he mentioned the will, Lana told him there was no will. In fact, she insisted that there was no will. By this point, Chris and Nick were growing especially suspicious of Lana. There were too many red flags. After some discussion, the two made the decision to call the coroner and request an autopsy and toxicology report before Steve's body could be cremated. She agreed without hesitation. The autopsy revealed that indeed, Steve had not died from a heart attack. In fact, all of his organs looked to be in good working condition at the time of his death. But when the toxicology report came back, they would find that there was an excessive amount of the chemical tetrahydrolazine, or THZ, in Steve's system. The coroner wasn't even sure what this chemical was, but when she researched it, she found that THZ is the active ingredient in medicated eye drops like Visine. Poisoning. This was the cause of Steve's death, there was no doubt. But was this something that a person might use to kill themselves? Was Steve's death accidental? Suicide? Or did someone use Visine eye drops to poison him with the intent to kill? The label on Visine eye drops clearly states that they are for external use only, and ingestion of any amount of THZ would cause physical damage. Dizziness, confusion, nausea, and vomiting are common symptoms, but a large amount, like the amount they found in Steve's system, would cause a reduced heart rate and respiratory depression. Steve's breathing would have slowed so much that he would ultimately stop breathing at all. With this finding, the coroner alerts authorities, and with the FBI and local police department in a neighboring room, she interviews Lana Clayton. Lana was confident.
Somebody one time told him that little Visine would help him go to the bathroom and put like 2 drops in his coffee and they could go to the bathroom.
And how long had he been doing that for?
For years.
Let's go over the toxicology. There's a drug called tetrahydrolazine.
That is his Visine. Mm-hmm.
The coroner confronts her with the toxicology report, and detectives enter the room to continue questioning her.
So I'm a detective with the Waukesha County Sheriff's Office.
I'm just
Overwhelmed, I'm sure. Yes, ma'am. Now listen, you are by no means in any trouble. We do want to ask you some questions. We have to read our miranda rights to everybody, okay? You have the right to remain silent.
Lana gets defensive and attempts to paint Steve in a bad light, telling them that he became abusive to her.
I'm wondering if he tried to commit suicide. He had a mood disorder. I always walked on eggshells. I didn't know what Stephen I was going to come home to. Or if he's angry, he would, he can be really nasty,
Okay. What is nasty, Steve?
He's really verbally abusive, calling him names, stupid, bitch. I feel I'm painting a bad picture of him. He wasn't, a monster.
Right now, the death is suspicious in nature. Did you make this coffee for him?
No, he made his coffee. Everybody keeps asking me, about the coffee, and I know they're wanting to know about the Visine.
Yeah, there's only 2 people in the house.
I know.
It was you and him.
I know.
Eventually, Lana ends the interview at the station, but she would allow detectives into her home to continue the discussion. And here, Lana finally admits to being the one who put Visine into her husband's drink. Not just a few drops, but the whole bottle.
Just what if I did kill him? What if I caused his death with the Visine? I just wanted him to suffer. I was just angry. He was just constantly, Lana, come here. Lana, come here. Help me to the bathroom. Do this, do that, and everything. And I don't know.
Just build up.
It just all just built up, and I just wanted him
to have diarrhea.
To just suffer.
To just be miserable.
She tells investigators something else, too. The crossbow incident that had taken place 2 years prior, it was no accident. She had been trying to protect herself from Steve as he came after her. But maybe this had really been just her first attempt to murder him in cold blood. Lana knew that she was in trouble, and she didn't want to face the consequences of her actions. It was either that, or she felt so guilty for causing death when she really just wanted to cause Steve pain and suffering. Either way, she couldn't handle the pressure much longer. She penned a note saying that she felt bad for killing Steve. She took a bunch of pills and turned the knobs of the gas stove on. She wanted to die. But she wouldn't die. It is unclear how the next hours unfolded. Did she realize she made a grave mistake and take effort to call herself help? Or did someone find her just in time to save her? In any case, she was taken to the hospital to be nursed back to health, and just after, she was arrested and taken into custody for the murder of Stephen Clayton. Detectives theorized that she'd been poisoning Steve with the eye drops, little by little, and then one day decided to go all in, pouring the entire bottle into his drink. He must have realized that he needed to escape, and he attempted to do so, but as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his breathing slowed to a stop, and he succumbed to the poison pulsing through his blood. They figured she had burned the will. Neighbors had seen her starting a fire just the day after his death, and they assumed that she had thrown the will into the flames. Under South Carolina law, if Steve died without a will, she would be awarded the entire estate. Investigators believed that this had been Lana's motive for murdering her husband. And Steve's family members believed that maybe she had convinced him to move to South Carolina all those years ago for that very reason. Lana would later plead guilty to tampering with food and drug and secondary manslaughter, and was subsequently sentenced to 25 years in prison. She still maintains that she never meant to kill her husband. Just 12 miles away, paramedic Joshua Hunsucker lived with his wife of 8 years, 32-year-old Stacy Hunsucker, and their 2 daughters. On September 23, 2018, just 1 month after Lana Clayton's arrest, Joshua had been sitting at the table, hunched over his computer, working. When he turned to get Stacy's attention, he saw her slumped over on the couch, unresponsive, not breathing, and already turning an awful shade of blue. She was immediately taken to the hospital, but was pronounced dead. Stacy had had health issues. She had a pacemaker placed in 2015, and it was assumed that she had died of cardiac arrest, suddenly and tragically, at just 32 years old. Stacy was a mother to 2 beautiful girls. She was a paralegal, but also worked for the preschool at her church. She loved life, crafting, going to the beach, watching sports, and she loved capturing photos of life's little moments with her daughters. Joshua didn't want to destroy Stacy's body by having an autopsy performed, and he immediately chose to have her cremated. Just 2 days later, he would collect on her 2 life insurance policies, which totaled $250,000. And shortly after that, he began dating a coworker of his. Stacy's mother found this all to be a little too suspicious, and she contacted the insurance department for possible fraud. It's unclear exactly how this next part unfolded, but there was some investigation into Stacy's death. She had been cremated, so her body was not available for testing. But she had been an organ donor, and a vial of her blood had been saved for those purposes. This blood was tested, and the report showed that the blood contained traces of tetrahydrolazine, THZ. There was no evidence that Stacy would ever choose to ingest something like that. And in December of 2019, over a year after her death, Joshua was charged with the first-degree murder of Stacy and insurance fraud. He is currently out on bail, awaiting trial. Just 1 month before his arrest, Joshua allegedly set fire to a syringe pump during a medical helicopter flight on which he was working, and the helicopter had to make an emergency landing at a car dealership. He pleaded not guilty to this felony arson charge. Most recently, and most strangely, Joshua Hunsucker filed a police report claiming that he'd been kidnapped and assaulted near a highway in South Carolina in February of 2023. He claims that he'd had car trouble one evening and pulled to the side of the road where he was kidnapped. His hands were tied with zip ties. He was assaulted and injected with some kind of unknown substance. And he claims that Stacy's parents were to blame. A police warrant for Joshua's truck would list its contents: an AT&T cell phone, a GoPro camera, a pack of 11-inch zip ties, 8 pairs of swabs, 11 latent lifts, and a tube of lipstick. No charges have been filed in this instance, but an investigation is ongoing. Just a few weeks after Stacy's tragic death in South Carolina, on October 3rd, 2018, in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, Jessy Kurczewski entered the home of 62-year-old Lynn Hernan, as she had many times before over the last 6 months. But this time, Jessy found Lynn slumped in her recliner chair, unresponsive, and surrounded by prescription pills and medication bottles. A strange, powdery substance, which Jessy assumed to be a crushed medication, lay across her chest. Lynn was dead. Lynn Hernan had been sick. With what exactly? Nobody knew. She had stomach issues, and she'd been in and out of hospitals for various ailments, but doctors had never given her a diagnosis. It got so bad that she often wouldn't make it to the bathroom in time, and she had to eat a special diet. Jessy's mother was a longtime friend of Lynn's, and Lynn no longer had any living family members, so Jessy offered to help her with day-to-day tasks that she could no longer do for herself, like grocery shopping, taking her to the doctor, and picking up her medications from the pharmacy. Lynn did not pay for Jessy's help. Jessy cared for Lynn out of the goodness of her heart. Jessy was not a nurse, so she did not help Lynn administer her medication, but it was clear that Lynn hadn't been taking it correctly. She was prescribed Xanax, and Jessy knew that Lynn would often take more than her prescribed dose. Lynn was physically and mentally exhausted from the recurring bouts of vomiting and diarrhea with no answers, and Xanax helped her to take the edge off. She didn't see the harm in taking just a little more than doctors had prescribed. Not only this, but Lynn would drink alcohol too. She'd been known to have a drink or two in the morning when she got up. But toward the end of September, Lynn's health deteriorated so much that she fell, and Jessy had to call a neighbor to help her up from the floor. This time, Lynn was transported to the hospital and would be kept there for 2 weeks. While she was there, doctors worked to fix her medication dosages and get her well. She was sent home, and 4 days later, Lynn Hernan was dead. Had it all been too much for her? Was she just so sick of being sick that she took her own life to escape the pain? That's what Jessy and her mother would say they believed had happened, and that is what the two would tell police in a subsequent interview.
The crimes and pictures, and I reviewed them before you came here. Obviously, it looks like she was trying to force down medication. The doctor will tell me if that's true or not.
Do I think it's suicide? Yeah.
You
I
do?
think she...
Because of her psychological issues?
Yeah, and I think when she went in the hospital, that was it for her. That was the last straw. If they couldn't find them, she was going to tell them whatever she wanted to get out of there. And I told her that. I said, she just wants to come home because she's going to do herself done.
She was just very, she was just tired of being sick. Mm-hmm. And she was frustrated because she wasn't getting the answers.
But the autopsy would show that Lynn died with a lethal amount of tetrahydrolazine in her system. She had been poisoned, and the manner of death was reported as homicide. Police looked into some of Lynn's neighbors and friends from beauty school, but none of them seemed to have a motive for wanting Lynn dead. Jessy Kurczewski, though, did. You see, Jessy was listed as a beneficiary in Lynn's will. Suspecting that Jessy might have had a financial motive for murder, detectives deep dive into Lynn's financial records and find that her bank account had been nearly drained by the time of her death. Lynn had given Jessy credit cards and cash to pick up medications. But what police found was more than a few $100s on Walgreens receipts. They'd found that 20 checks had been made out to Jessy from Lynn's checkbook. One of those checks was $130,000. Transactions from Lynn's bank account would show trips to bars and excessive spending at casinos. And in Lynn's state of health, she was obviously not frequenting either of those places. Several credit cards were opened in Lynn's name, and someone had tried to take out a loan in her name as well. Witnesses would tell investigators that Jessy was a habitual spender. One witness thought that Jessy must be in loads of credit card debt, because she often gifted her with hundreds of dollars worth in spa gift cards, and gifted her children with expensive items like laptops and Game Boys. Jessy told police that Lynn had always been generous, and she knew she wasn't going to live much longer, so she wanted to make sure she spent her money on everyone else before she died. But detectives would find theft of nearly $300,000 from Lynn. When confronted with the toxicology report, Jessy adamantly denies having anything to do with Lynn's death, telling detectives that there were eye drop bottles all over the home. Detectives tell her that no Visine bottles were found near Lynn's body, So they'd come to the conclusion that she had been murdered. But then, Jessy tells detectives that actually, she had seen Lynn consuming Visine several times, in fact, because vodka was just no longer cutting it for her. And, in fact, Lynn had been trying to commit suicide by drinking Visine, Jessy tells police. She would mix different dosages in water bottles, and it would make her very sick, but it never did kill her. Jessy then tells police that Lynn had been researching different ways to commit suicide and had even bought a gun online. But Jessy disposed of that because she didn't agree with suicide. Then, one day, Lynn asked Jessy to bring her a water bottle. The water bottle contained 6 bottles of Visine. Jessy tells police that Lynn told her it contained 6 bottles of Visine, but she brought it to Lynn anyways because Visine hadn't killed her yet, and Jessy thought that it probably wouldn't this time either. So she just helped to give Lynn exactly what she wanted: death. Later, Jessy would tell police that she had several items stashed away that might help her case. Recordings of Lynn's last wishes, the gun, dated Visine bottles, and other papers that Lynn had signed. But she wasn't willing to show them to detectives unless they let her out for a while to get those things in order. Actually, she had them buried. She drew a map for detectives and tried to help them find the items over a virtual call, but detectives came up empty-handed. At trial, Jessy was found guilty of first-degree murder and theft of movable property less than $100,000, but more than $10,000. But in an unusual turn, her case has been postponed because a friend of Jessy's brought the prosecutors a 37-page letter. The letter had been written on the back of Jessy's trial notes and was later sent to her friend. In the letter, Jessy asks her friend to create fake signed documents and record herself as Lynn, saying that she had wanted to commit suicide with Visine. The letter said, quote, "See if someone would make a voice tape. I know this is crazy, but I gotta try. It's worth it, 'cause it's my life." She has an older, raspy smoker's cough and was sick. Female voice. Always coughing and smoking. I feel like there's programs online to change voices. There's so much technology these days. And I have the wording for that recording. Honestly, you could even have a movie or music on in the background to help distract. I would just be cautious that it's music or a movie from before her death if you do that, so it doesn't raise a red flag. End quote. The letter goes on to mention a few specific movies the recipient could use, examples of documents she could create, and lists all of the items she'll need to complete Jessy's plan. Jessy denies writing the letter and accuses her lawyers of being involved. With this accusation, Jessy's lawyers have requested to withdraw from the case, and their requests have been granted. There is a status hearing set for January 2024. The 3 stories I've told today suggest that trust can be a fragile illusion. These unsuspecting victims fell prey to the very people they held dear. A stark reminder that those closest to us may hide an unimaginable darkness within. And without the meticulous work of the medical examiners and the science of toxicology, The truth behind these heinous crimes may never have surfaced. The victims' deaths might have been ruled natural or suicide, and their murderers would still be walking the earth free.